Well, thank you, everyone, and thank you, Anna, for showing us this short acknowledgement of country video here. I'm on Ngunnawal land in the ACT region, and I pay my respect to the elders of this area, but acknowledging that everyone joining today and our speakers are on different parts of traditional country. The Paul Bourke lecture series of the Academy of the Social Sciences in Australia honour the late Paul Bourke, who was president of the Academy from 1993 to 1997. Paul was a renowned Australian historian, and he was a fellow of the Academy and will be well known to many of you, I'm sure. The Paul Bourke lectures are given each year by the recipients of the Paul Bourke Award the previous year. So the Academy of the Social Sciences in Australia each year awards the Paul Bourke Medal to early and mid-career researchers, early or mid-career researchers who have really excelled in their disciplines. The medal has been awarded in different ways since 1987 and currently is given to 4 recipients each year. And Elise, our speaker, received the Paul Bourke Medal last year. A couple of quick housekeeping notes before I hand over to Professor Helen Sullivan, who will introduce our speaker. Everyone has done this a million times now, so everyone's already familiar, I'm sure, with the Zoom controls, the muting in particular. We're going to be recording our speakers, but not participants. So you'll be able to see this the talk and the question and answer session after the event, but you won't be on the recording yourself. And we will have a Q&A session at the end of Elise's talk, but we'll try and do that through the chat function. So if during the course of the lecture or at the end you wish to ask a question, please just write your question into the chat function and we'll go through and select questions for Elise to respond to. So with that, I'll hand over to Professor Helen Sullivan to introduce our speaker.
Thanks so much, Chris. And I'd like to add my thanks to all of you for joining, and also my acknowledgement. I too am on Ngunnawal country, and I'd like to extend my respects to elders past, present and emerging. It's my very great pleasure to introduce Dr. Elise Klein. This feels a little bit of a cheat, but we at Crawford at the ANU are not at all shamefaced about this. As many of you will know, Dr. Klein until very recently was at another university in Australia, and I'm delighted to see that there are many of her old colleagues on Zoom at the moment. Dr. Klein, as many of you will know, is a senior lecturer now at the Crawford School of Public Policy at the ANU. She received the Academy of Social Sciences Paul Bourke Award for Early Career Research in 2019, as Chris has said. Her research interests include the rise of therapeutic cultures in policies, neoliberal subjectivities, economic rights, and decoloniality. Dr. Klein's research and practice are premised on taking full account of the complex intersections between colonial pasts and present, post-colonial legacies, settler colonial realities, and failed development initiatives. Dr. Klein regularly informs public policy, appearing before Senate inquiries into the cashless debit card, community development programme, and Indigenous youth suicide. Dr. Klein has held various roles, including working on the UN Secretary General's high-level panel on women's economic development and the Human Rights Committee within the United Nations General Assembly. She was awarded the Medal of the Order of Australia in 2019, and I'm delighted to be able to introduce her lecture today. Over to you, Dr. Klein.
Thank you. Thanks, Helen, and the Academy for hosting today. Thank you, everyone, so much for joining. I'm just going to share my screen just because I have a few slides. But first, I want to acknowledge First Nations leaders past, present and emerging. I also acknowledge the beautiful yet unceded lands of the Wurundjeri, where I live and currently where I'm in lockdown, and the Ngunnawal and Ngambri, where my academic home, the ANU, sits. Thank you for your endurance and tireless work within these settler colonial regimes, and I hope today's lecture adds something useful. To Helen Sullivan and the Crawford Public Policy team, thank you so much for welcoming me this year, and I'm extremely grateful to be working with you. Also to Fiona Haynes, Monica Minagal, John Altman, Uma Katari, and Martha McIntyre, a massive thank you for supporting me in this award. I want to say a particular note of thanks to John Altman, who I first met when I took up a postdoctoral position at the Centre for Aboriginal Economic Policy Research at the ANU. John's quality research and community work speaks for itself, but his support of many early career researchers, his humour and engaged criticism that sparks the will to do more and to serve more, and I feel extremely grateful to have got to work with him over the years. I will say, whilst stating the obvious, that no research is ever done alone. And I want to acknowledge my dear family who are joining today and my many brilliant colleagues in the university and also in the community who I have the privilege of working with along the way. Thank you for challenging me, teaching me and pushing me, and I always hope that my work does justice. I give this lecture as part of an award created for early career researchers, but I have to be honest, I feel a large sense of, I guess, survivor's guilt. I don't say surviving lightly. Making your way through the academy as an early career researcher is definitely not easy. Secure employment is rare and employment precariousness is the norm. This year alone, thousands have been stood down from casual and fixed term contract positions. But we're not just seeing academics being laid off, but also exploited. The underpayment of our colleagues has been ongoing, which has just been made public in the last few months. So I urge all of us that have been lucky enough to be left in the academy that we work towards renewing the university to what it should be. This is not just so our colleagues can return, but it's also about the sake of the future of the social sciences, which is in the hands of early career researchers as much as anyone else. So I don't use the term exploitation lightly here. It is, and it's an ongoing condition of capitalism. But today, I want to focus on another X of the economy, expropriation. And in particular, the expropriation of care and social reproduction more broadly. So first, some definitions. The term social reproduction is the effective and material work that ensures we continue to exist in the day-to-day as well as over generations. There is no society or indeed life without the dangerous work of birthing, as well as the many practices of which I will refer to today as care, such as raising the young, caring for the elderly, maintaining homes, building and sustaining communities, and the vast work of ecological care. So we easily see care work during catastrophes. Often it's the work of hope. So if we just think of the bushfires, the care given to communities, the care of injured wildlife, the support given to people grieving, the distribution of supplies. Also here now, again during COVID, both paid and unpaid care work has really been at the front line of fighting fighting COVID. But the reality is, this work beyond crisis is also here in the day-to-day, keeping us all together and alive, but this work often goes unnoticed. Care work is largely unpaid, and if not unpaid, then underpaid, and it's feminised. Work relegated to women through gendered norms that structure not just the roles we take on, called the gendered division of labour, but also the very conditions that make this relegation possible. The essential point being is that no society, let alone economy, works without care and social reproduction more broadly. The capitalist economy relies on, or as Nancy Fraser says, free rides on, this unpaid work. Unpaid care is valued insofar as it is a condition of our functioning, yet this work is treated as if it's free. And just so you can get a sense of if there was a monetary value placed on care, this picture that you see in front of you is drawn from the ABS in data from 2006, which is the last time use surveys were conducted, estimated the value of unpaid housework, volunteer and community work in Australia ranged between somewhere between 41% and 58% of the GDP. And so you can see where that's placed amongst other countries. But you can see in terms of, comparatively speaking, Australia free rides a lot on this unpaid care work. So while there's much to say about methods of quantifying care, or even the desirability to, it points to the scale, at least, of the free riding of unpaid care work in the economy. Fraser expanded on her idea of free riding of women's unpaid care work in her 2008 Bourke lecture in economic geography to a form of expropriation, which she defines as, quote, domination unmediated by a wage contract. This was in the context of her defining expropriation as a crucial condition of capitalism, which has long been noted to include slavery, colonialism, and neocolonialism, but can also include the work, women's social reproductive work. So working with Fraser's definition, we can think of care work as unpaid care work as expropriation because there is no reciprocity in that it's treated as free. It's obviously without a wage contract, and it is structured under domination of patriarchal structures. But as I will show, also class, racial, and settler colonial structures too. There's much to say about this expropriation of unpaid care and social reproduction more broadly, but today I'm going to focus on the unpaid care work of one group of largely women in society, those placed on the federal government's mutual obligation program called Parents Next. My research is part of a bigger project with Eve Vincent from Macquarie and draws primarily on in-depth interviews, including First Nations women who have been placed on the program. What is particularly troubling about the expropriation of these women's unpaid care labour is the free riding is not just disavowed, but they are actually targeted, stigmatised and punished in the process of their labour being expropriated. What I hope to show today is that this punishment, stigma and targeting circles around what is considered as work. The stated aim in the explanatory statement of the legislative instrument for Parents Next says that the program aims to increase female participation in the workforce. Yet this dramatically overlooks the unpaid care work women are already doing. In interviews, women spoke about how they were working on average about 18 hours a day. Their work included not just caring for children, which was often done as the sole parent, but also working unpaid in the community, doing things like running domestic violence support groups, working in Meals on Wheels, advising community groups, looking after the elderly and other people's kids. Some of the women were also studying for paid vocations in care, things like psychology and nursing. Parents Next was first piloted in 2016, but expanded to 2018 to 75,000 mostly single mothers across Australia. The explanatory statement also states that they thought that it would be including about 10,000 First Nations women. The initial pilots of Parents Next included communities with a high proportion of First Nations women specifically, although any charge of racial discrimination is avoided not because of our weak legislation, but also because of the use of the term at risk, a term like remote communities increasingly being used as a proxy for race. This not only points to how First Nations people are disproportionately used as trial participants in Australian social policy, the cashless debit card is another such example, but also the intersection of the expropriation of social reproduction with the expropriation of women enduring settler colonialism. The research question driving this project is why, when care work is so essential to life and the economy, would some women who are at the forefront of such life-giving and essential work be subject to mutual obligation? As you know, mutual obligation has been suspended under the initial response to COVID. But as these conditionalities on welfare payments start back up again, this question is more important than ever, as it draws light on when and under what conditions is care work considered legitimate, and who are constructed as legitimate subjects to be undertaking it. Part of the answer goes to tensions about the primacy given to wage labour as a source of women's liberation and indeed liberation in general. But it also goes to deeper questions of justice and the economy, which have been ongoing throughout Australia's settler colonial history and remain central today, particularly so when discussions about what a post-COVID-19 Australia looks like. To consider these questions, I will first give an overview of how, over time, this expropriation has been legitimised by gendered regimes, followed by an examination of social security and gender under parents next. And then I'll finish with a few suggestions on how we may want to consider care going forward. So a major aspect of the ongoing expropriation of women's unpaid care work is the separation of social reproduction on one hand to production on the other, which is seen as the sort of formal economy. This separation is fundamental, making care work seen either outside the economy or not quite the economy. Indeed, it's not just a separation here, but it's how reproduction is subjugated to production. The separation and subjugation are legitimised through various gendered narratives, which have shifted throughout European history. So firstly, the separation of reproduction from production was through the construction of the gendered private and public spheres, which cast social reproduction as the natural yet subjugated role of women. This treatment of mainly white women in the European metropole was brutally intensified with the intersecting modes of expropriation of women enslaved and colonised peripheries. Secondly, the separation of care work from production was through what was called the family wage. Here we have again an explicit sense of gender difference and gendered roles, valorising the male breadwinner and subjugating the female homemaker. This patriarchal structure of the family wage was thought to function as a distributive mechanism through which wages gained by the male breadwinner was imagined to extend to unpaid dependents such as wives and children. The Wages for Housework campaigners in the 70s described this system as a kind of social factory, taking the idea of the factory floor and expanding it to describe how women who undertook unpaid care work were indeed the factory workers of society, although their work, unlike male factory workers, was unpaid. But it wasn't just white women's unpaid wage that was being expropriated. In Australia, First Nations women were stolen as children and forced to work in white settler homes. The Bringing Them Home report is one such important document showing how widespread this expropriation of First Nations women's labour was and how it underpinned the Australian family wage structure. Whilst aspects of these gendered regimes still remain today, the current regime is more about what Nancy Fraser refers to as the two-earner family, where both men and women are expected to be in the labour force. Because unpaid care work is still largely obscured, what this has meant is that women have two jobs, one where they are paid for, although many of these jobs are notoriously underpaid and precarious, and the other not. This regime, as Nancy Fraser states, quote, "Women are considered equals of men in every sphere, deserving of equal opportunities to realise their talents, including, perhaps especially in the sphere of production. Reproduction or care, by contrast, appears as a backward residue, an obstacle to advancement that must be sloughed off one way or another en route to liberation." Formal labour has not meant liberation. The underpaying of feminist industries that feature paid care flows on from the free riding of unpaid care, where paid care work is seen as unskilled and not as valuable as other vocations. We also have a gender pay gap, poverty in retirement, and the general precariousness, which are all too common features of women's lives. Now we're in recession, termed the pink recession, where women in low paid and precarious jobs have been some of the first to be laid off, and others have the strain of working full-time under lockdown whilst caring for children. This current regime of the two-wage earner has also meant that the idea of the social factory contained through the family wage has transferred to what feminist political economist Sylvia Federici refers to as the global plantation. Care work that was undertaken for free by middle class, working class and Indigenous women in Australia has been transferred to the global south and migrant women who are paid low wages while having to subsume the burden of unpaid care for their own children. The point being, through these regimes of gendered norms, coupled with enduring expectations of women's virtue and love, unpaid care is continually relegated to outside the real economy, rather than being seen as an essential condition of its very working. Now, the social security system largely maps onto the various regimes of separating women's work from the real economy. But it's social security in this current two-wage earner moment with the expectation that both adults in the household are working, and I want to focus on today. Specifically, how mutual obligation, which is a major feature of our contemporary social security system, intensifies women's expropriation. But first, some comments about social security and gender more broadly. The first thing to say about social security is that social security systems celebrated in the global north have been largely reliant on another aspect of expropriation, the taking of global south resources, lives and labour. The recognition of which goes back to what Marx called primitive accumulation, which has later been expanded on by scholars such as historian Eric Williams, showing how slavery and colonisation were fundamental to Europe's industrial revolution, and racial capitalism scholars showing how the continued dispossession of racialised peoples aid capital accumulation. Expropriative processes are not just in the past. Accumulation by dispossession is ongoing today. The expropriation of lives, labour and land of Indigenous and racialised populations continues to feed development in the global north, the very processes that allow us to have social security. It's part of what Walter Mignolo calls the dark side of modernity. Since the independence of global south countries from European and Western colonial powers, expropriation has continued. Development policies have played an important role in the expropriation of global south resources and labour through structural adjustment, land grabs and the privatisation of public assets. The Australian state has also been engaged in the settler colonial process of the Australian continent, which, as many First Nations scholars have shown, has come with the expropriation of First Nations land and labour. And this still continues today, something that I'm currently exploring with Frances Markham from CAPA. And in Australia, social security has been an important driver of settler colonialism. First, through rations and indentured labour and slavery on pastoral leases, pearling ships and domestic spaces, but has continued today with the use of welfare conditionality and mutual obligation to target subjectivities not aligned to the settler ideals of the responsible wage earner worker, such as through the remote work for the dole program, CDP, income management like cashless debit card and the basics card, described by people in the East Kimberley as, quote, like going back to the ration days. The second thing to say about Australian social security is that since Federation, it has largely revolved around what Francis Castles has called a wage earner's welfare state, in that it is privileged people who earn a wage, and historically that has been men. Women, like many others, have fallen through the cracks of the deserving-undeserving dichotomy created in the wake of giving primacy to wage earners. Welfare, in its most progressive moments, was playing largely catch-up for white women, plugging holes in the gaps left by patriarchal capitalism. Things like various iterations of the widow's pension, child and maternity payments, and later parenting payments and subsidised childcare. But all of this has given primacy to male-dominated wage work, where unpaid care work was undertaken largely by women and has constantly been seen outside of the real economy. Single mothers have particularly been subjugated. Social security was set up not just as a wage earners welfare state, but also a welfare state largely revolving around the heteronormative nuclear family model. Single mothers presented a problem to capitalism's ability to use the nuclear family to hide the expropriation of women's unpaid labour. The result, in part, has been stigmatising of single mothers. And there's a long history to this stigma, a history which includes vagrancy laws that prosecuted women and an emphasis placed on the institution of marriage as the solution to what was seen as, quote, the depravity of the unmarried female, who, to also quote historian Joy DeMoucy, were thought would, quote, otherwise live a vagrant, wandering, idle, vicious life to the end of their days. Early in the 20th century, eugenic ideology permeated through Australian society, including progressive policies, which focused on what is known as positive eugenics. Instead of sterilisation and the breeding out of certain traits, negative eugenics, positive eugenics encourage the development of desirable traits. And so how single mothers raise their children was one area of concern by some eugenicists. But with the shift towards the two-wage model, the story is one about the feminising of mutual obligation programs, which intensifies the turning away from social reproduction and care as work towards wage labour as being counted as the real work. For example, in 2016, the then Human Services Minister, Christian Porter, commissioned PwC to use actuary data to identify groups in the population that would have the biggest cost to Australia's social security in the coming years. Single mothers, along with young carers and young people, were the top three groups identified. Young people because they would need support to seek further study, but carers and single mothers because they are working, but their work isn't counted as work and they are seen as dependent. Underpinned by neoliberal ideology and in the name of getting people to be lifters, not leaners, as former Treasurer Joe Hockey stated, we now have seen two things. First, the de-investment from actual payments made to individuals with no raise to New Start except inflation since 1994. But also important to note, there have been cuts to the parenting payments, especially those that single parents rely on. And two, the investment in punitive programs which go by the name of mutual obligation, to which Parents Next is one. Mutual obligation sees conditions placed on what people have to do to receive their social security entitlements. These conditions, like work for the dole and other make-work activities, enforces people's attendance, which are often stigmatising and can be disconnected to the needs of the people subjected to them. Mutual obligation is mandatory, and so people who are often met with sanctions if they do not undertake these obligations. So Parents Next is compulsory for parents who have been receiving a parenting payment for at least 6 months, whose youngest child is between 6 months and 6 years, and who has not reported paid work to Centrelink in the last 6 months. People placed on Parents Next are enforced to develop a participation plan with the service provider, which includes agreeing on specific activities that parents will undertake that, quote, to quote the Department of Employment, fits with family life and education employment goals and to help prepare them for work. People on Parents Next are then expected to fulfill these activities as part of the compliance requirement, which also includes provisions for not just turning up for the activities and provider appointments, but also to self-report their income regularly. Attending these activities is not voluntary. Failure to attend activities or to self-report results in the suspension of payments, which is often their women's only source of income. Women in my interviews found these activities redundant. One interviewee was told she had to take her child to a library group. She couldn't understand how this helped her to get job ready, as she was already a qualified chef, taking time off to look after her sister's high needs daughter. Two more interviewees were already studying for degrees when they were put on Parents Next, and their activities given to them by the provider was just to continue doing the study they were already doing. The interviewees were aware that the provider was paid money by the government to retain them in Parents Next, despite the provider offering no value to financial support to activities they were already doing themselves. But my focus on unpaid care is not to say that interviewees weren't looking to or wanting to engage in the labour market either. However, employment options were often limited to precarious positions, which didn't work around women's commitments to their children. The same interviewee referenced above, who was looking after her niece with high care needs, said, "Look, I'm happy to work, but unfortunately at the moment I can't work. I've got commitments with my niece needs me, and that's just the way it is. Once she's in school, I'll go back to working during school hours like I did with my older two." Interviewees also noticed that available jobs were often low paid too, which made it hard to financially justify sending children to childcare, even with subsidies. Other women just wanted to care for their own children and did not want to send their children to someone else to look after. An important point sometimes overlooked in the promotion of free childcare so that women can work. Some parents may just want to do the care work themselves. The 2018 Senate inquiry noted many of these issues that recommended the Parents Next program should not continue in its current form. The Senate inquiry recommended that, quote, Parents Next be reshaped through a process of co-design with parents and experts into a more supportive pre-employment program which meets the needs of parents and acknowledges the addresses the structural barriers to employment which they face. This has not happened, and Parents Next continues. What was not taken up by the Senate inquiry is the very subjugation of women's care work to notions of formal employment, which is intensified under Parents Next in three notable ways. First, for interviews dealing with compulsory requirements of Parents Next under the constant threat of sanctions, was just more work put on the shoulders of these already busy women. To quote one interviewee, "I'm doing it all, but I'm stretched. I can't seem to do anything right." She said, with two girls and at the same time was looking after her girls, was studying to be a qualified nurse, even though she was a skilled nurse in the UK. Another interviewee with a high needs daughter said, "It's not that I'm sitting at home watching telly on my bum, not happening. I'll welcome you to come and watch me, see how busy a single mum's life gets with no family support, because it's very difficult to having family here when you can leave the kids with the grandma and then go, or have a partner you can safely co-parent with. That's just not the case." Women's lives in care work was often refracted through violent patriarchal relations. Not all, but many women interviewed had experienced domestic violence. For some women, it was the domestic violence that pushed them into needing social security support, as that they had to leave quickly with limited financial resources, or had to quit or reduce employment in order to look after their kids. Telling is how women recovering from the trauma of domestic violence felt that Parents Next was like entering another abusive relationship. To quote, "The conditionality is like a new violent relationship, financial and psychologically abusive," one interviewee said. The second way expropriation is intensified was through what some interviewees referred to as the profiteering of service providers contracted to administer Parents Next. This view suggests that care work undertaken by women put on Parents Next is expropriated not just by the economy and broader society, but also through not-for-profit surplus and private company profits. As Chris Grover argues in his analysis of UK welfare conditionality, the unemployed person is treated as a commodity in developing employment service markets. But also to note is that some interviewees talked about how their service provider was trying to mitigate the harshness of the government's program. This provider would go out of their way to remind women of activities they had to attend and try to divert the targeted compliance framework so women wouldn't be breached if something came up. Now, there's a lot to say here about the community sector, in the role of community sector in mutual obligation. It's complex. For many organisations, this has not been an active choice, where they've had to respond to changes in government funding models with the rise of new public management. This effectively saw community services, which were focused on well-being of their communities foremost, now to have to balance that with the requirement to show efficiency and effectiveness. The opening up of these services to private companies also intensified competition for dwindling resources. Community organisations have been met with a choice: take the government funding of their programs, including the dreaded targeted compliance framework, or possibly not survive. Yet there are others that have taken the government's mutual obligation framework uncritically. The third way expropriation is intensified is through the stigmatisation of people put on Parents Next. Stigma is associated with the government's mantra of reducing what it sees as not just welfare dependency, but intergenerational welfare dependency, described like a disease that children may catch from their mothers. One interviewee on Parents Next, living regionally, talked about the stigma she had experienced. She said, "It's like an echo chamber. But that's what happens a lot when you're a single mum. You're stigmatised into it's a harsh word, but the useless pile. You're never going to amount to anything because you've ruined your life by not having a husband. We're social lepers." This concern of welfare dependency and the broader intergenerational poverty discourse has historical links with eugenic thinking, where only the desirable women should be encouraged to have children. Such narratives emerged again in 2020. The past Australian Prime Minister Tony Abbott publicly stated that middle-class women should be supported to have children, stating that, quote, "While I'm in favour of stay-at-home mums, if that's their choice, I do think that a properly conservative government, acknowledging that having a family is one of the most wonderful things that anyone can do, would make it easier for women in the workforce to have more kids. That's a real problem in every Western country. Middle-class women do not have enough kids. Women in the welfare system have a lot of quick kids," end quote. The point being is that this stigma around women on welfare, and particularly single mothers on welfare, further legitimises the expropriation of their labour. It's not just that their work goes unnoticed, it's that their work, at least 18 hours a day, 7 days a week, undertaken often alone, is denied completely. Instead of recognising how the economy is dependent on and expropriating their labour, they are accused of being welfare dependent. So where to from here? So just a few points. We need to go further than finding the balance between family and work. This has been an important fight for the last 30 plus years, and whilst it may have helped some women, many others themselves either find themselves in precarious or underpaid work, or stigmatised by social security. We must also not forget the men and women in the global south who are still left patiently waiting for development's promise of employment. The informal economy really is the global economy, in which some countries include up to 90% of the labour force as the informal economy. So alongside important efforts to make waged labour better for those lucky enough to be in it, is the importance, and it's important, but there also needs to be a focus on the liberation of care. It's about confronting the ongoing subjugation of reproduction to production. We need deep structural transformation of the social order that reinvents the production-reproduction distinction. Perhaps a first step would be to take the unpaid care work undertaken by women on Parents Next seriously. They not only care for their children, they often work for others, other people's children, and older people. They undertake work in the community, engage in study, and they do a lot of this often alone. In their work, these women show that care is productive and a cultivating task, something that Silvia Federici has pointed to when she says care can be a creative task rather than a burden, breaking down the isolation that characterises the process of our reproduction, creating those solidarity bonds without which our life is an effective desert and we have no social power. This is not to romanticize care. As outlined already, we need to resist that care is a wholesome or unpolluted, pleasant, ethical realm. Still, and staying with the trouble, to quote Donna Haraway, there is possibility to emphasize the potential of care as both a practice and an ontology to disrupt the status quo and to unhinge processes underway leading to what Tony Fry calls our defuturing, the unraveling of life from ecological and economic crises. This is not only just about delinking economic security from wage labour, but also re-socialising economic relations altogether. Why do I say this? Well, care is foregrounded in relations of mutuality and trust, based on social relations of solidarity. Care breaks down the individualised model, so common in the Homo economicus age, and sees us all in relation. As Iris Young explains, it entails recognising that agents are related in many ways they have not chosen by virtue of kinship, history, proximity, or unintended consequences of action. Care is not just the immediate and the local, but also concerned with responsibilities that span time and space, or as Doreen Massey says, we are responsible to areas beyond our bounds of place, not because of what we have done, but because of what we are. This is about confronting and taking action around historical and contemporary dispossession and inequalities. Care is about breaking down the human-non-human divide, also important, especially given these times of ecological destruction. And care shows us very real practices already underway, and it's all around us as the concrete work of effect and maintenance and the vital politics in interdependent worlds, in caring for, with and about others, human and non-human, in taking responsibility for our political and economic complicity, and in caring enough to listen and act. Great. Not a small task, but there are two possible tools that may be useful in reconstructing this gendered order: a basic income and a reparative way of thinking, yet neither are silver bullets. First, and following many others, such as Nancy Fraser, Carol Pateman, Kathy Weeks, is a basic income, which could support the redistribution of care work for all to undertake. Giving time back to people would allow everyone to take part in care work without the threat of destitution. A basic income won't cover the cost of such and the value of such work. Sorry, a basic income won't ever cover the value of such work, but it would at least provide economic security to allow people to do the care work. Colleagues and I have been working on one possible option: a livable income guarantee paid at the level of the age pension, along with other supports such as childcare, rental assistance, disability support and family benefit payments. Yet the challenge that comes with the basic income is to ensure that it breaks down the gendered norms about who undertakes care work. So it isn't just a class of basic income women doing all that work while men take dwindling formal paid employment. The livable income guarantee that we've been working on has a participation requirement to encourage the distribution of care work. Another option is the idea of reparative social support. Whilst reparations have generally been paid as a form of individual redress, there is a literature arguing that reparations can be an important transformative tool in addressing structural inequalities. This is the work that myself and Liz Spokesman from the University of Oxford are doing on reparations for colonisation and slavery, but worth considering how these ideas may work for gender injustice as well. This thinking is about moving towards various forms of redistribution plus recognition, in line with what Deborah Thomas calls reparations framework for thinking. There are various possibilities here, programs and policies that collectively address women's subjugation in the domains of patriarchal violence, housing, food security, the tax system and superannuation. The point is proposing measures not necessarily in the name of equality, but as a reparative way of thinking. It would be important, though, that these measures add to and not take away from efforts underway that are seeking reparations for settler colonialism and other racial injustices. But if there's a genuine concern with expropriation, it should guide a concern for both. A thought anyway. But just to conclude, whichever way forward, we need to refocus on subjugating social production to production. Thank you, and I look forward to your thoughts and questions.
Thank you, Elise, and thank you for that really thought-provoking presentation. There's lots there. For those who've joined us since Dr. Klein's presentation began, we're going to use the chat function for questions and answers. So anybody, could I invite questions from the floor via the chat function, please, and we'll put these to Elise. So the first question from Chabul Khan. Elise, can you see that? Can you read the chat, or shall I read it out for the audience as well?
Sorry, maybe read it out just so everyone can
okay.
hear it.
So I'd like to ask Dr. Klein in what ways she thinks the targeted compliance framework itself reproduces the gendered and racialised expropriation of care observed in Parents Next. This appeared to me as an underemphasised element in the Senate inquiry deliberations.
Thank you, Chabelle. I think you're absolutely right. And this target compliance framework, you know, has had a lot of scrutiny outside of the Senate inquiry, but I tend to agree with you, perhaps not so much inside. The targeted compliance framework is a kind of system that is used by service providers, I guess, to sort of universalise the regulation of people on Parents Next and other mutual obligation programs. And what it's doing is it makes it harder. So when I was talking about the interviewees who had providers that were trying to mitigate the effects of Parents Next on their behalf, it makes it harder for service providers to do this. And so when things come up that are sort of outside the kind of norms of a waged labour idea, you get a warning and you can get, and then you get sanctioned if along the line of the targeted compliance framework. And it makes it harder for service providers to do this. Now, of course, things come up all the time and often at last minute, and life doesn't always revolve around these ideas of the sort of waged work kind of ideas that are trying to be instilled through the Parents Next piece. And it's often very hard for women with kids where things come up. And so, you know, I think the point about the targeted compliance framework is well taken, and thanks for raising that.
Thank you, Elise. There's a couple of other comments in the chat, but no other questions yet. Perhaps while I give other people a chance to pose any questions, are there any countries, Elise, that we should be looking at as an example of where this is done better? Are there any templates or models that Australia could learn from?
Well, I mean, often people sort of refer to the Nordic countries, but I think what often gets overlooked in these examples is that they're settler colonial countries like Australia. So their development and social security programs have been established off the backs of Indigenous land and labour in similar and differing ways to Australia. And so, you know, I think this is the sort of important piece of why the lens of expropriation is really important, to not just focus on the expropriation of women, but the intersections with that with other forms of expropriation that, you know, fall along the lines of colonialism and slavery as well, and the ways in which expropriation works that feeds into what we understand as the formal economy, and all the people that are caught up in that. And so the kinds of responses that sort of get put forward in, say, Nordic social security systems don't really go to the heart of those issues of how populations in the global south and Indigenous populations are, lives are wrapped up in the development of these social security systems.
Thank you. So we do have a couple more questions here in the chat, and there's a two-part or combined question here about more information or elaboration on how reparations might apply in a gendered context, particularly in the context of a universal basic income, and how that might play in.
So how would reparations might apply in a gendered context, please? Well, I mean, this is this does need way more work and thinking. Look, I think the first thing to say about reparations are that it's often as paid either to individuals, or there's an idea of collective reparations. So there's a need to think about that distinction. I mean, I think in terms of the gendered space, I mean, my big concern is that I don't know if gendered reparations should thwart or come before reparations for racialised violence. And so, in the Australian context, there have, First Nations people have been calling for reparations for settler colonialism for a long time. And I'm not quite sure if I'm comfortable to see the sort of gendered argument to replace or to be put forward before that important argument, particularly at a time when, we're talking about treaties, we're talking about truth-telling. But I do think, there could be an important way to frame social policy in this sort of reparative way of thinking. Instead of sort of arguing for equality, to argue for these social policies to be introduced as a reparative form, which would require an explanation of why that is so, which would require an explanation of the ways in which unpaid work, unpaid care work has propped up the Australian economy, the global economy for a very long time, and continues to do so. And I think that recognition, that telling the truth of the economy and the real economy is a very productive and important thing to do.
Thank you. So there's a couple of further questions here around COVID-19. The first is around your thoughts on whether the disruption caused by COVID-19 could act as a point of rupture where we start thinking more broadly about the dynamics in which people give and receive care outside of the heterosexual nuclear family.
I really hope so, Sam. I really hope so. But I mean, already, with the conditionalities, or just thinking about Parents Next, already with the conditionalities being brought in, I think there was a moment where we could have been hopeful, or we were hopeful that, something like mutual obligation would, be rethought, particularly now we're in a recession and more people are unemployed, and maybe it's easier for people to understand that unemployment is complex, and it's not the structural conditions of unemployment are the focus, not individual deficiency. But yet now we're sort of seeing conditionalities be brought back in, which is is a concern about the hopeful moment of what COVID could bring. So whilst I hope that it might challenge and change, and I think in some ways it does, but we're still seeing the reproduction of some of these harmful narratives even during COVID.
Thank you. Another related comment, perhaps it's a question or a comment. It's a hard one to answer, but whether the government expenditure on COVID relief might be used either as a change in the way we think about social welfare, or is it going to be an excuse to reduce future social security payments? Perhaps that's, well...
I mean, that's yeah, that's a really great question. I mean, I think already seeing the reduction and the concern of the sort of the reduction in the supplements paid to people, and some of the discussion around the reasons why, you know, the 550 couldn't continue on, and now the sort of return of the concern of the debt, you know, makes us sort of think that we might be returning back to narratives before COVID. But you know, I'm ever hopeful, and yeah, I hope I'm wrong.
All right. Well, thank you, Elise. We're almost at time, so I might, in the absence of any more questions in the next 10 seconds or so in the chat, I'll just thank you and Helen, the Crawford School, and everyone who joined us this afternoon as well. There will be a recording of this lecture on the Social Sciences Week website and on the Academy of Social Sciences website, so do look out for that and feel free to share it with your colleagues. Thank you again, Elise. It's been a wonderful talk, really thought-provoking, lots there, and I'm sure everyone, myself and everyone else, will be thinking about some of your thoughts and comments and pondering for quite some time to come. So thank you once again. Thanks everyone for coming along, and I hope you are able to get along to some more of these fantastic lectures and events this week as well.
Thank you. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Bye-bye.